Welcome to another video. Today is the 13th of March. Today I'm going to be doing an update about the Donetsk sector, specifically around Avdiivka, and then I'm also going to talk about Bakhmut and some of the changes in and around the city itself. Let's get into the situation around Avdiivka, which I think is pretty important as we're going into the future and as Bakhmut begins really to fall. We're going to have to start looking at some other urban clusters where there may be engagements, and Avdiivka is one of them. It's one of Russia's highest priorities at the moment, and that's evidenced by the fact that they're now beginning to attack the northern flank of the city itself. So let's get into some of the specifics of this attack. So I talked about previously how the Russians use their positions in the town of Novoselivka, Druha, to then go in, attack the town of Vesele. First, they took over the hills that were adjacent to the town of Kramatorsk over here. Then they attacked Vesele. And now it's being reported that they were able to take over all of Kramatorsk, where I said previously that Ukraine had set up some firing positions. But I suppose that it wasn't enough to hold back the Russian assault, and maybe they have retreated to some more fortified areas elsewhere that are closer to Ukraine's supply lines into Avdiivka. Now, using the town of Vesele, the Russians have now been able to assault the town of Kamyanka from the north. So not only is Kamyanka being assaulted from the east, where there is a road that leads into the town, but also from the north now. So they're being enveloped really from all sides. I would expect the town of Kamyanka to fall in the coming days. It'll be very difficult for Ukraine to retain their position over there, but it is important for them to hold the Russian forces and pin them down in this specific area for as much as possible, because then their offensive will lose steam as they approach the much larger urban center of Avdiivka. Because imagine if it's difficult for them to storm this relatively small town that only has a few blocks and a few houses, then how are they going to take over the entire urban center unless they go around and attack the flanks? But for that, you also need to assault certain towns. So every single town is another challenge and another obstacle on its own, which needs to be overcome. So let's look at what Russia has to deal with in order to cut off the town of Avdiivka. Well, in between Krasnohorovka, you don't really have much until you reach this area to the west of the rail line. The Ukrainians are obviously not using the rail line, but maybe they're using some sort of path adjacent to the rail line to supply the garrison in Avdiivka. Then you also have the town of Stepove, and some roads that are leading from there into the northern part of Avdiivka around the coke plant. So taking over Stepove is the first step to taking over the highways and the roads that lead into Avdiivka. And then from there, you'd have to take over towns such as Berdichi, Semenivka, and then Orlivka is the most important, because Orlivka, it connects Avdiivka to the west, to the north, and to the south. You see there are 4 different roads that branch out from it. So taking over Orlivka would really make it the situation in terms of logistics and resupplying Avdiivka much more difficult, because once you reach Avdiivka, really the only area that could be left to supply them would be Torenke and this other town, I can't even pronounce it, this one over here. And by then the ring would be so close to being fully closed that it would be very difficult for Avdiivka to be supplied anyway. So really taking Orlivka would be the checkmate in regards to encircling Avdiivka. Now doing this, it's going to be extremely difficult. Look at how long it took to even break through into Krasnohorovka, and now we're going to have to see them repeat this process elsewhere in other towns. And so yeah, it will be a challenge, but as the situation in Bakhmut develops favorably for the Russians and they begin to send in more reinforcements into this specific sector, maybe they will be able to increase the speed at which they advance, because really the first year of the fighting they barely advanced in the sector besides their initial offensives in this direction, which weren't even that successful in the first place because of the extensive fortifications that the Ukrainians set up around Avdiivka. Avdiivka may be the most fortified city in all of Ukraine at the moment. Maybe Marinka is more fortified, or Novobakhmutivka, but Avdiivka really is up there. So it will require a lot of effort to take it over. And I think part of the reason why we're now seeing this Russian advance, which relatively is significant, obviously the area that was taken over is just like 2 towns, but relative to the other months where there was basically zero gains by the Russians, we are seeing this uptick because Russia is starting to send in some of their mobilized personnel to really patch up and fill up some of the losses that the DPR experienced. They had a very difficult time advancing in this direction against the Ukrainian army, and they really didn't receive that much support from the Russians in the first year besides some artillery supports. So now we're actually seeing infantry move in from the Russian side. There are some Russian units that moved in. Some of them are obviously mobilized, so they won't be as combat effective, but there may also be some other Russian regular units that have some of the war experience from the beginning of the war that are moved in. I don't have exact information about the units that were moved in because this is a relatively recent phenomena, but from before the Russian redeployments into this specific area, we did have units like the 9th Separate Marine Regiment and the 68th Guards Tank Regiment, which I think is a part of the 150th Motor Rifle Division. And so that's the situation in Avdiivka. In addition to what's going on the ground, there's actually some activity in the skies. So the Russians, they are increasing their aerial and drone attacks in this direction. Ukrainian sources, their reports, and there have been a lot of different strikes, not just artillery and drone, but also using actual aircraft, something that we have not really seen Russia use on a small scale up until recently. They are using their aircraft to attack some of the towns that are connecting the city of Avdiivka to the wider rear that is supplying the urban cluster. As I said before, towns like Orlivka, they're being struck right now. And then also this coke plant, which is really a really good position to dig in and also stockpile on weapons. This area is also being targeted according to the Ukrainians. And now there's also talks that the Russians will use their new UPAB 1505 guided bombs. And these bombs, they have inertial and satellite navigation. They have a huge warhead. And the aim of this guided bomb is to destroy fortified objects. That's what they're designed for. And look at this. The coke plant is one of the most fortified objects in all of the Avdiivka sector. And you have some other industrial areas over here. You have a quarry, a rail station. So there are a lot of targets that Russia could potentially strike in the near future in this area. And the UPAB is really a great resource for the Russians in that regard. And it has a precision that is pretty similar to the JDAMs that were given to the Ukrainians. And so it's not just that it's pretty large, but it's also pretty precise due to the navigation that I stated previously. And so yeah, this could actually turn out to be a very potent force for the Russians in this sector. We've already seen Russia begin to deploy these bombs around like Chernihiv, but I'm pretty sure that it wasn't able to cause any damage. There was one, I think it was I don't remember which one it was, maybe Su-35 that was shot down over Donetsk Oblast by the Ukrainians, and when it was retrieved, they saw that there was an UPAB that was attached to it. So we're now seeing the Russians begin to deploy them. I don't know how many they have, so they might run out of them if they use them on a large scale in Avdiivka, so they might have to ration it. But again, it is something to look into in the future, and it will be very interesting to see how the battles are shaped by this new air support, because it is absolutely needed. It's very difficult to just do these head-on assaults onto fortified Ukrainian positions. Even when you have a manpower advantage, it's much easier to just be mounted in a set position and fire upon your enemies, especially when they don't have as much aerial support, which is why they need that aerial support, and they also need that reconnaissance support. So let's go up now to the situation in and around Bakhmut, which is what the video is mainly about. So since the last update, the Ukrainians have actually conducted a limited local counterattack, taking over some of the tree lines, bush lines around here, which just relieves the pressure around Ivanivske by a tiny bit. And it further indicates that Ukraine has a large troop concentration in this area, and that the Russians are not really focusing on this direction specifically. Because honestly, if the full Ukrainian troop concentration could be pinned down in this certain area, then they can't be used elsewhere to defend against, For instance, assaults on Ukraine's northern flank or assaults on the city center. So it might actually be a good thing for the Russians to keep the Ukrainians at bay over here while they conduct most of their offensive activity elsewhere. So just to the east of this, around the Korsun-Skogo streets, which connects to the T-0504 highway, which connects Bakhmut to Ivanivske, you are seeing the Wagner Group and Russian forces advance gradually towards the street. The street is important for the Ukrainians, one of the main streets that's connecting the city to within the inside and with neighboring towns. And now the front line has shifted towards the street. The Russians were able to advance from this parking lot towards some residential blocks. They have not taken over these apartment buildings yet, but they do need to take them over, and they need to take over the school and some other structures in the area, like these ones over here. Once they do that, they're going to have a pretty good base and some very good firing positions to use to dominate over the rest of the residential blocks in this area. And that could be used to finally cut off the supplies to southern Bakhmut without even having to take Ivanivske in the first place. Here's a video that was released by the 24th IDAR Battalion, I believe, and it shows how there's house-to-house fighting going on right next to the streets. The houses are really badly damaged, but they could still be used just for some cover from small arms fire. So that's what's really going on in this area. You are seeing the IDAR attempt to conduct counterattacks in this direction against the advancing Russian forces. Another area where Russia is advancing is around the spearhead leading towards the central area of Bakhmut, the city center. And every day we're receiving new reports of Russia advancing a few blocks in this area. And now this poses a threat to the Ukrainian forces that are stuck over here. I don't know which units are here specifically, but whatever groupings are in southern Bakhmut, they are in danger of being encircled. Now, a lot of people were exaggerating the threat that they could be encircled, because obviously if there was this really large threat that they would be encircled, they would withdraw. I'm pretty confident they would have the capabilities to withdraw without being totally isolated and creating an entire pocket and being destroyed in it. But at the moment, they're not withdrawing yet. They're probably trying to hold the Russians for as long as possible before they have to fully withdraw. And once they withdraw, the front line will look something like this. And that would just give Russia further momentum to advance towards the city center. So in the city center, we haven't really seen much of a difference since the reports of the Wagner Group had crossed over the river, which again, I said it was more so just like recon operations and just small scale attacks, nothing major yet. Now, this is another place that's very interesting. This is the Azov industrial facility. I've talked about it a lot, and that's because it's sort of like the Azovstal of Bakhmut, but on a much smaller scale, admittedly. The tunnels here, they could potentially be used by the Ukrainians for some sort of defensive action to bog down the Russians, but we know that there were some tunnels in this meat processing plant, and because of Russia's advances around the river, they just had to withdraw from it entirely without really using them. So, using the meat processing plant, now the Wagner Group has an area from which they can enter the tunnels from underneath and begin to clear them out. Some Wagner sources claim that they are already underground and that the tunnels are 320 meters deep. And so that's where some of the fighting or some of the Wagner operations may be occurring right now. And now we're also hearing reports that they're beginning to storm some of the facilities within the Azov district. Azov district looks sort of like this. It's very vertical. And within the district, there is a metal processing plant where there has been some back and forth fighting going on. So that's really the situation over here. The Ukrainians still control most of the district, but the northern parts are in danger of falling to the Russians. And the Russians really want to take it over quickly before Ukraine can mount a protracted defense over here, because this could be one of the best areas for them to do so compared to some of the residential blocks. Even the apartment buildings could be used, but this would be really the best facilities, the best location for them to mount a defense. So they're not only trying to flank it, but they may also try to assault it head on. Now, if we go a bit further to the west to the town of Kramatorsk, there are now rumors that the Russians have reached the T-0506 highway. This is according to our RIBAR map, which really shows the situation looking something like this, with the Russians having a bit of a foothold near the road. Maybe they don't have full physical control of this specific area, but it shows them very, very close to the road, to such an extent that no car would dare pass through it, because it's only like a few dozen meters away from the road based on Rybar's depiction. Now, I don't know if that's true, because, you know, we haven't really received any confirmation from other sources, and because it would pose a threat to Ukraine's supply lines to such a level that we really would have seen some sort of Ukrainian reactive sort of action based off of that. But who knows, maybe it's possible that the Russians reach this road and that Ukraine is now being forced to use the minor roads that connect the T0506 road, like over here. Like you see this yellow route over here, maybe they're using this one, which sort of like diverts from the main course, but still ends up connecting to it before linking up with the town of Kromove. Maybe that's what's going on. And so maybe even if Russia does have a position near this part of the road, the one that sort of goes in a like semicircle, maybe even if Russia has that, then it's not the end of the world for Ukraine's supply situation on this route, because there are some minor routes that branch out and then connect back to the city of Bakhmut. Now let's go a bit further to the north around Bodanivka. There are reports again from Rybar that there has been a significant advance in the direction of Bodanivka. I have not changed my map since the last video, but based off of Rybar's map, it would look something like this, which would mean that they're very close to the outskirts of the town. Now, the issue with assaulting Bodanivka is that, yeah, it is on a valley, but everything adjacent to it is on a higher ground. So Ukraine, they probably have some sort of mortars or artillery set up in this general area, trying to fire onto the Russians as they advance. If they just go in without protecting their flanks and just create this bulge within the town, then it could be dangerous and they may just be pushed out. So that's the threat of assaulting Bodanivka head on. So I'm pretty skeptical of these reports, so I've not changed the map. Now, going north, this is where we've seen a lot of Russian advances in recent days. So last time I was talking about how Wagner confirmed that Dubovo-Vasiliivka was under their control. Since then, they began to advance along the valley, which connects Dubovo-Vasiliivka to Orikovo-Vasiliivka. And now they have been able to take over about maybe half of the town. The other half is basically a gray zone, with most of the Ukrainian formations retreating to the town of Minkivka and other towns adjacent to it, like Holubivka and Privilia. And the reason why Wagner was successful in this assault is because they took over the surrounding heights. So they first, on March 12th, took over the hills over here overlooking Orikovo-Vasiliivka, and they launched 2 assaults, one from the heights and one from the valley, and pushed the Ukrainians out. And so now the Ukrainians, they are firing upon the Russian positions with 120mm mortars from the Minkivka area to try to slow down their advance. At the same time, due to these gains by the Russians, they have been able to flank Zaliznyánske, and so the situation there is very difficult for whatever Ukrainian garrison remains. I would not recommend they stay there, because they are going to be totally isolated if the course of the battle doesn't change. They may have to withdraw. To where will they withdraw? That's a good question, because there aren't any towns in between Zaliznyánske and the road to Nikiforivka, and so if they were to retreat to like a town like Bondarne, then it would sort of be like giving up all of the open fields in between these two key roads. And the roads I'm referring to are the E40 highway, which connects to Slavyansk, and then this smaller road over here, which is linked to Nikiforivka and then to some other larger towns that supply Donbass, and then also that one links to the E40 highway. So it would give the Russians some pretty advantageous positions in these open fields, and they would be able to take over some high ground in certain areas overlooking the E40 highway and the Nikiforivka road. Now, let's talk about the fact that these gains have actually really helped Russia in terms of shaping the battlefield for future battles, because now if you look at it, if you measure the distance between the Russians' furthest positions around Orikovo-Vasiliivka to the city of Kramatorsk, the distance really from about here to here, which is really the outskirts of Kramatorsk, is only about 20 kilometers. So at that point, you could begin to move in some of Russia's 122mm field artillery and that could be used to begin to fire upon the Ukrainian military installations and their extensive fortifications on the outskirts of Kramatorsk, maybe on the airport, for instance, where I'm sure there are a lot of military assets. And so this will present a danger, because although the battle in Kramatorsk will not begin for a very long time, in preparation for that battle, the Russians will have a lot of open area that they can use to set up batteries and fire upon the Ukrainian positions. Now, the issue with bringing your field artillery so close to the front lines is that it could pretty easily be destroyed by your opposition. And so I don't think they'll move in these shorter range howitzers for a while, maybe until the front line sort of reaches the water canal. Once that happens, maybe they'll start moving them to these positions, and then they could fire upon Kramatorsk within a pretty effective firing range, which could deal a lot of damage to the Ukrainian positions over there. They could also fire upon Nikiforivka. As I said before, it's an important supply hub for the Ukrainians. They could also fire upon the town of Alexandrivka, which is another key supply hub that also links up with Seversk. And then in terms of Slavyansk is about 23 kilometers away from the current front line. And so again, it's going to take some time for the shelling by the shorter range artillery to begin. But if Russia continues to advance along the E40 highway like they've been doing for a while, and I don't see a reason why they would stop at the moment, because they could apply significant pressure over here, and there aren't that many Ukrainian forces in this specific sector that can act as a opposition, an effective opposition. Look at the units that are stationed over here. You have, for instance, a 46th Brigade. It used to be one of Ukraine's best units. Fought in Soledar and suffered some pretty heavy losses. And now, according to some of the battalion commanders, they are suffering incredibly high losses. And many of those losses are from the more trained and battle-hardened people. And so now those ranks are being filled up with people who are very inexperienced and don't have as much capabilities on the battlefield. And so it's not just that they have a lack of artillery support and have, again, limited air support and have limited recon support, but then again, the troops that are actually fighting on the ground, they are becoming less and less experienced as the more trained Ukrainian forces begin to die in these battles like Bakhmut and also in Soledar, as was previously mentioned. And so we might begin to see the effects of that in a sector like the like this E40 highway area, where they may not be as well prepared for Russian advances, and they may have to retreat even further to some of the other neighboring towns along the Donbass water canal. And so, yeah, that's the current situation around Bakhmut and Donetsk. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later.